Thank you. Yes, we will continue on with the show. Also want to plug again real quickly the QR codes that you have on your table so you can engage with us in the polls that we have, as well as Wi-Fi codes. But we are going to continue the conversation with my colleague, Adva Saldinger.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to welcome my panel up onto the stage. We're going to be talking about mobilizing SDG investment amid sort of the current economic headwinds and challenges that we're facing. And so to join me for this conversation, I've got Jorge Moreira da Silva, who's the Executive Director of the UN Office for Project Services, UNOPS, Stephanie von Friedeburg, who's a Managing Director of Banking and Capital Markets Advisory at Citi, Alice Albright, the CEO of the Millennium Challenge Corporation, and Alix Zwane, who's the CEO of the Global Innovation Fund. And we are at an UNGA that's sort of characterized by a moment of stocktake. And a lot of the focus has, of course, been on how far we are from meeting the SDG goals. But we're very, very far from meeting the financing goals as well. The sort of financing agenda that was set out at Addis has not materialized. The idea of mobilizing, billions to trillions and getting the private sector to commit trillions of dollars to these important issues turned out to basically be a fallacy. It was very unrealistic. And so what I want to talk about today is why we have faced some of those challenges, why that money hasn't been mobilized, and what can be done moving forward. What types of tools and instruments and partnerships, government policies, new funding is necessary to actually ensure that there is the capital there, which exists in the broader financial system, and that it is directed to solving these critical issues of reducing poverty, of addressing climate, and all the various other SDGs. And so I really want to start by asking you this question of, why have we not succeeded so far? And Stephanie, I know you've spent some time thinking about that from a perspective of why the private sector financing hasn't been mobilized. You spent a lot of years at IFC where, part of IFC's job is to try to mobilize private finance into these issues, and not always perhaps as successfully as some people would like. And now you're sitting at Citi with sort of that private sector perspective. So why don't you kick us off?
So Adva, thanks. And it's great to be here this afternoon. I just want to throw out two statistics that I think are super important to frame the conversation. So first, the Fairday team in France did a survey, and they actually looked at net flows. So last year, net flows were $1 trillion to emerging markets. They were 700 billion this year. So we're moving backward, not forward. And the OECD did a very interesting review of all the MDB products and tools that were delivered between 2018 and 2020. Only 18% of those had a tag or an outcome of private sector capital mobilization. So a lot of ODA, a lot of donor money, none of it moving in the right direction. So I actually think there are both tactical and technical issues and a couple of strategic issues. So let me rattle off two technical issues. First, there really is a shortage of projects, of bankable projects. And what you see, especially in climate, is competition between the commercial sector and the development finance institutions for those very limited projects. And in many cases, the development finance institutions actually use their less expensive capital and nudge the commercial banks out of position. So that's one. We need way more bankable projects, and we need to put a lot of donor money at that. And, when I was at IFC, we created the IFC 3.0 strategy to work upstream and build that pipeline. It's coming to fruition, but it's not nearly enough. I think the second thing technically that we need to think about is transparency, rule of law, and governance. And then strategically, what I think is super important now that I've crossed the fence are two things. One, we need to radically change the way we collaborate. And we need to do it not at the 80,000 foot level, but down in the trenches where we each understand the constraints that both sides face so that we can close that gap. And the final thing is we all need to come together and see what we do about regulation. I mean, we use U.S. taxpayer money to create development finance institutions and de-risking tools. And we turn around And our regulator prevents banks like Citibank and Bank of America and JP Morgan from using them because the regulation has gotten so complex since the financial crisis.
So I want to pick up on this issue that you raised about government policy and project development. And I want to turn first to Alice. And I know at MCC you work a lot with countries to assess the economic constraints and then develop really large compacts or grant agreements where you're working with them to address some of those economic constraints while also working on key policy changes to create the enabling environment. So I'm curious from your perspective, what you see as the role of MCC, of other institutions who are working closely with governments in improving those enabling environments and sort of unlocking that piece of the challenge.
Thank you, Adva. And again, lovely to be here. I always love coming to Devex events. I'm glad we're sort of focusing on the finance piece. I do want to tell people that we continue to, in our own way, deploy significant amounts of money to projects. Just this week, over the course of literally a few days, we're deploying $590 million in all grant funding to 3 different compacts, one in Mozambique, one in Kiribati, and one in Kenya. So we're continuing to do our part in moving funding, and we're very honored to be in that position. I kind of want to key off with something that Stephanie said, which is we've got to go from sort of the very big picture aspirational down to what I'm going to call the basic blocking and tackling to find out why does a particular market, why is it difficult for private capital to come in? And this is what it requires you to look at sort of the ecosystem. What are the regulations that are getting in place? What are the rate structures that don't make sense? Are there rule of law considerations? Is one public utility not particularly working well with another public utility? And it's these kinds of questions that really are the reason why when we start our work with a government, we start asking the question, what are the key constraints to growth? And we start out often with looking at some of the policy and institutional barriers, which aren't sort of at an up here level, that are a very down here level. And our intent is to create a better ecosystem. We then invest hundreds of millions of dollars in grant funding, and then spend a lot of time at the early stages talking to local businesses about what they perceive as the barriers. So the whole point is to improve the ecosystem. Now, I also want to agree with Stephanie about how I do think that we can do a better job as, whether or not it's the bilateral sector, the multilateral sector, figuring out how to work together in a way that is more efficient and more streamlined to really focus on deal by deal by deal to get deals completed. And I think that we can always do a better job on that. And given what you said about, where things stand on the financing for development agenda, it is incumbent on us now to say we have got to be more efficient in how we work together.
Yeah. And one thing I may come back to, because I think one thing I often hear is that that working on sort of a bespoke one deal at a time system isn't going to work moving forward, that a lot of things have happened that way, blended finance transactions that are one at a time, that are all different, so that you need some mechanisms that are easily replicable and scalable. But we'll come back to that question of scale. Jorge, I want to go to you because I know you probably have some thoughts on sort of this idea of building project pipeline from the country level. This is something I hear a lot. I think there is more investment needed at that local level in project development. And a lot of people like to talk about how that's a challenge. There's not a ton of capital going into that, and it can be challenging, but there certainly are organizations that are out there that have good models who are doing that, who are investing in projects that others say aren't possible. And I know, Alex, you might want to say a few things about that as well. But Jorge, let's start with you.
Thank you. Well, as you know, I just started 5 months ago in this position on UNOPS. So I feel very tempted to go to my previous discussions when I was leading at OECD, the Development Cooperation Directorate, and the DAC Secretariat. I will not go into that, but indeed, I'm seeing something from this perspective on operations, that is my perspective now, that may answer to the gaps that I was identifying when I was in the other side on the mobilization and on alignment. We have been talking a lot this week, but also in the preparation to the UNGA about the gaps, the policy gaps, the financing gap. But there is a gap that must be also tackled. And in my opinion, it's part of the root causes of the financing gap. That is the capacity for implementation. We may have all the finance that is needed. We may have even the policy reforms that create the good enabling context. But at the end, if you don't have capacity for implementation, if you don't have the capacity to generate with the best technical skills, with the quality standards, the bankable projects, you will miss the opportunity. So I think that, and let me bring a positive tone also about the discussions that are happening at UNGA. For the first time, I'm seeing a discussion that goes beyond mobilization and alignment. The financial architecture is being discussed. And this being discussed not just at the Bretton Woods, is being discussed at UN. And I think that this is a good signal. We know that part of the problems that we face on implementation of ADIs, it's the lack of mobilization, ODA, not reaching the levels that we all wanted. Also the fact that when we get blended finance, it doesn't go to those most in need. It's going very often to middle-income countries and not to LDCs, to SIDS, to the most fragile context. But beyond this mobilization and alignment agenda, something was missing regarding debt, regarding leverage capacity, even the governance of the MDBs. So I'm seeing, I wouldn't say a consensus. It would be very risky to use the word consensus, but I'm seeing convergent views through all these initiatives, Bridgetown, the initiative that the Secretary General has launched on the global financial architecture, also the initiatives that the World Bank has launched and the decisions that the bank has taken with the new leadership, also the Macron and Mia Motley summit. I think that there is a drive in this new financial architecture. But again, going to my first point and ending with that, the capacity for implementation is fundamental. So I think that we have to invest on technical assistance in supporting countries developing their best bankable projects. And I think that this third gap is probably the one that is less discussed. Thank you.
No, that's a really good point. And you bring up an interesting point on mobilization as well, because there is a risk, of course, if you focus only on how much private capital you mobilize. It's much easier to mobilize that private capital in higher income markets, in big projects. But you may get more impact, and the money may be better spent in places where maybe the private sector is less likely to go, and those are often lower income, smaller projects. And so then you have to really create a balancing act between when is mobilization the priority and when is building markets in some of those low income markets the priority. Alix, I want to turn to you at the Global Innovation Fund. You guys are experimenting with different instruments, looking at how you can try to blend capital in effective and interesting ways. Tell me a little bit about, what you've learned on that front, what instruments you think are working right now, and what needs to be built up.
Yep, thank you very much. And pleasure to be here with you all and everybody back at Devex's annual meeting at UNGA. I think I want to start with a little story that I think will illustrate some of the challenges that Stephanie and others have been speaking about. An early investment that GIF made about 6 years ago now was in a company called Babangona, working in northern Nigeria, doing sort of end-to-end service provision for farmers, helping them get the right price for their product at the right time. And Babangona had gotten some grant funding, I think actually from the British High Commission in Nigeria, had raised some grant money, had some local debt, but was really looking to scale up and needed significant working capital, and had begun some conversations actually with the IFC about doing this. But the price on that debt and the timing on that felt very risky to the leaders of Babangona because they knew that their currency would be depreciating and they wanted to be quite patient at the pace with which they grew their business. And so they started a conversation with GIF where we ultimately ended up structuring a deal where GIF agreed to take a subordinate position and essentially make our loan in local currency to Babangona, which then allowed them to crowd in other more senior dollar-denominated debt on top of that, including ultimately from the IFC. We were also more patient in the tenor of this loan so that they were allowed to pay us back over a slower period of time. Now, the currency did in fact depreciate, as everyone anticipated, and the returns that GIF made from that were concessional, not market rates of return on that investment. But we did, in fact, crowd in significant additional capital for that company. So I use it as an example of, yes, you need to be incentivized, I think, to do that in a way that other DFIs are not necessarily incentivized to do that. That's deliberately given as the mission of GIF, more mobilizing, less lending, as what we really are supposed to be doing. So that's sort of point one, of really agreeing that this is possible, but you need incentives aligned to make that happen. A second point I'd love to make, and I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts about this, Alice, is that we have some mismatches between time horizons. You know, it takes a very long time for social change to happen. You know, I think you're going to hear later this afternoon from Bill Easterly, who has a great paper that he wrote a couple of years ago, where he looked at the so-called Washington consensus reforms 30 years on, and was able to say, oh, with the 30-year time horizon, we see that those reforms taken in the 80s and the 90s are really paying off in terms of growth. That's a 30-year time horizon. When you just looked 5 years after that, you know, everyone was saying, oh, it's the last decade. Where's the growth that was supposed to come from all these policy reforms, et cetera? So we have this timing mismatch on both policy reform and I think on the flavors of capital that firms need when they're building the markets that they're selling into. So I think part of what I'd sort of encourage us to do is think about incentives that we're creating, I guess, on the ground, just as much as at the strategic level, and figuring out how to get some of this timing more lined up between the folks we want to back and our own political realities. I could say something also about, you know, creating platforms so you're not going deal by deal on this stuff, but I'll hold off until that seems more appropriate.
So you brought up in the example of Babangona foreign exchange risk. And I think one of the conversations I've been having in recent weeks with people is how big of a constraint that is, especially right now in the current economic environment. Foreign exchange risk, the need for more local currency lending. And these are things that often the DFIs aren't doing, some of them can't do. And I wonder if anyone on the panel would like to talk about sort of some of those risks and what instruments could be developed. How can we solve some of those challenges? Alice, do you want to jump in?
It's a big problem. Just one anecdote. We're working with one country who is working in one of their utility sectors. And right now they are very, very dependent on a foreign currency denominated source of that utility. And in the current environment, with interest rates globally what they are, this has become a major constraint to that country's overall financial wherewithal. And so I think that one of the things that we need to talk about more at this juncture of the SDGs is how do we take into consideration the impact of foreign exchange risk on the overall development ambition, and what does that mean for the solution set? And I know there's a number of local banks in the room, so I very much would want to talk to you about it, but how can we make local bank currency, local currency lending more available? Because that is something that doesn't really get talked about very much, at least sort of in the SDG context, but it's something that may be a very important part of the solution set. It's not something that my agency is sort of set up to do, but if it was done well by others and we could work with them, it would really add.
So can I jump in here, Adva? Because when I joined Citi, I had this exact idea that, you know, there's local banks that have local currency that aren't using that local currency. And so I've been working with Citi's treasury. We have franchises in 95 countries around the world, like the broadest global footprint of any bank. A lot of those franchises actually require us to take those deposits and leave them in central banks. And again, if you go back to the regulation of that, the capital set aside can be as high as 150%. So it's not accretive to Citi to actually park that money with central banks. So we are now designing a product to lend to the multilateral development institutions in the DFIs so they can use our local currency to deploy in country. Which I think is going to be a fabulous opportunity. It's great for Citi, it's great for the development finance institutions, and it's a win for development. But the thing about FX that gives me pause, so foreign currency is a risk. It's one of the risks that exist. And it has kind of blossomed into, if we can solve this, we can solve the problem. I'm not sure that I agree fully with that. And I worry greatly that we're talking about taking very large sums of ODA and donor money to create new institutions, to create guarantee facilities that, quite frankly, in the medium to long term, will distort markets. And there's a reason why exchange rates move. And if we start distorting those markets, how do we choose which markets we're going to distort and which markets we're not going to distort? Because there's not enough money to actually do it globally. And I would really encourage the entire development community to take organizations like TCX that were created by the development finance institutions and give them a push, put them on steroids, so that we can actually start making some progress around foreign exchange risk.
I want to ask one question, because I think often, especially when we're sitting in a place like New York and talking about policies, there can be a disconnect between the needs of local communities and what leaders in venues like this are talking about. I had an opportunity recently to speak with, some local community activists, and they say so often whether it's ODA or whether it's DFI capital comes into their communities and tells them, you need this business, this is what we're doing here. And it doesn't align with their desires or their needs. And so I wonder if you have thoughts on how do we make this finance, as we're looking to generate more of it, mobilize more of it, responsive at the community level, and also responsive to the needs. I think we're seeing a debate about not letting climate finance overtake development finance, and that's also about being responsive to local needs. So, George, do you want to jump in on that?
Thank you. I'm quite, as you know, aligned with your question, because, for instance, on ODA, not because something is good, that should be audible. And you know that we have spent decades discussing what is audible and what is not audible. And I think it's really important to take benefit of preserving ODA, but also benefiting from other measurement tools like the total official support for sustainable development that measures all cross-border flows, regardless the concessionality level, not only measuring the public, but also the private finance mobilized, South-South cooperation, triangle cooperation, and the contribution to the global public goods. So you have one concrete example of it really matters the way you measure things. Other example, it's removing the eligibility of fossil fuels from ODA. That decision was taken. It was important in this marketplace. So the financing for sustainable development could be considered a marketplace where you have supply, you have demand, and you have the need to regulate. So my point is, if we really want to achieve the results and ensuring that these are locally driven and aligned with developing countries' aspirations, there is a role to be played by regulators, both at the national level, but also at the multilateral level. So if we just let the market function, see what's happening on blended finance. We created all these fantastic guidance and guidelines on blended finance. I was part of that. But let's look to the figures. Only 5% or 6% of blended finance goes to least developed countries. Only 6% of blended finance goes to health and education. And we know that for SIDS, the basic dilemma that they are facing is existence. So I think it's very important to pursue a journey of reform, not only at the local level, national level, structural reforms, but also in the multilateral system. We shall pursue this reform agenda. And that's why I think that the discussions that are now being held, not just in Washington, but also in New York, are particularly encouraging.
I wanted to follow up on this question of blended finance, right? Because there is a needed sort of continuum, right? You need the grant capital, and that has to play a specific role. You need the blended finance to de-risk investments so that the private sector will come in. I don't think that continuum always works well. And I think, to your point, blended finance, probably the best use of ODA dollars is in the lowest income markets, and that's not happening. So my question to you is, what can be done to flip that, right? To flip those numbers or change those numbers and change the current paradigm and ensure that that continuum works the most efficiently, that the right capital is used in the right situation.
Yeah, thanks very much. When USAID and the British government set up the Global Innovation Fund, I think it was precisely as an experiment in that space. Within the aid agencies themselves, innovation was funded through challenge funds, oftentimes in which there's then this big cliff that innovators and entrepreneurs can drop off of because they haven't fully de-risked themselves for commercial capital. And on the other hand, the DFIs, rightly so, were engaged in more private equity style investing at big ticket sizes. And then so there's this space in between. The Global Innovation Fund was then launched with this mission of impact first venture style investing. Now, that is easier said than done, which I learned the hard way, because you don't want to just be the one who's in the market for lemons. You don't want to be the last guy. There's a reason no capital is flowing to something. You have to be able to think about, particularly, is private capital misallocated in this space because of externalities, because of mispriced risk, because of other uncertainties that mean R&D is underinvested in per se. And so we've really had to take on a very different lens to making investment choices than I think would be traditional even in impact investing funds. Then we also certainly hoped at GIF, and this goes to your point, that projects would graduate from GIF, which is a relatively small fund in the grand scheme of these things, to the USDFC or to BII, then CDC in the UK. And that was happening, but not happening fast enough. I think that we do need other funds, and maybe it stops being ODA eligible money, at some point, that continue to say, it takes time and patience for some of these for growth for firms in some of these sectors, that we need different vehicles with different flavors of capital, and yes, blended, to invest in them. So we're launching a second fund at GIF that very much will take debt finance, precisely because we want to put more pieces along the line of that trail there. And I think, to your point about local communities, I actually wanted to say something that goes to what I think makes MCC so effective, which is MCC's real commitment to growth. And unapologetically, that's what the mission is. And often, I've seen some survey results that suggest that something like 60% of USAID's money goes to things that are not listed by local people in sub-Saharan Africa as among their top priorities for themselves and for their communities. And so I think there's something, and DFIs with their commitment to job creation and being an energy in the economy all do contribute to that growth agenda as well. But maybe we need to be talking about that in a more whole of government way than maybe we do right now.
So we only have a few minutes left. So I have a couple closing questions that I'll let you guys sort of answer as you wish. And one of the questions is this question of scale. How do we get this to scale? It hasn't happened to this point. What needs to happen to do that? Another question is this question of veracity, because I do think that if funds are allocated in a way that are not achieving impact or are not allocated quickly enough to achieve that impact, you're not going to get to the end result. And so there has to be trust and measurement to ensure that not only is the capital spent and put out there, but that it can be trusted to deliver on the results. So kind of those questions, how do we scale? Is there hope? What sort of steps need to be taken? And how do we ensure that sort of veracity is there behind the capital flows? So anyone want to kick us off?
I'll jump in and thank you for a shout out to MCC. So let me touch on the issue of veracity, how capital is impacted, and the question of measurement and growth, and try to tie them all together. So we have a very distinct business model, which is absolutely, as you've said, based on the concept that we're going to look to reduce poverty through economic growth. It's very clear. And we start in that journey by working with countries. We're very selective. We only work with countries that are running their economies well, investing in people, and are trying to be democracies and fighting corruption. So it's very, very clear who we work with. We then start a dialogue that asks a very fundamental question to a country partner, which is, what is your biggest challenge to growth? And we let countries choose what priorities we fund with them. And then they're very involved in project design, and then they're very involved in project implementation. So by definition, what we do is very closely aligned with what a country sees as being its own growth path. In terms of veracity, we can track how every dollar is spent. We evaluate every single project. We sign up with countries together on a set of metrics that define what does good and outcome look like. And then we track it. So it's a very linear, clear, transparent business model. In terms of scale, I will always believe that more money, in terms of official money, needs to be allocated to international development, no matter what government, what DFI, what philanthropic organization you're talking about. If you look at the return on investment, I'm not talking about in a securities sense of the word. I'm talking in a what is the right thing to do word. If you think about the challenges across the globe to do with instability right now, whether it's climate related or otherwise, or all the different sort of impacts of loss of hope for people, investing in the well-being of countries makes a huge difference. So I think that we've got to scale. We've got to figure out the scale and the money, but I do think we can do a much better job, as we've talked a little bit about what is the most efficient way to bring in different sources of capital alongside of ODA. And I think that's, given that we're halfway through this round of SDGs, where we could really make some progress in moving that.
So, Adva, I think if you look at the United States, the beauty of our economy is driven by capital markets. And if we really want to get to scale, that is the model going forward. So how do we tap into capital markets globally? How do we create deeper, richer capital markets on the ground in countries so we solve the foreign currency problem as well? And that takes me back to where I started, which is we need very different kinds of partnerships. So we just did a very interesting transaction with IDB Invest, where we actually flipped one of their loans into a capital markets transaction. It's something they don't typically do. They don't take mini perm risk. They don't take rollover risk. But if they were willing to do that, we could come in the construction. We could send it into the capital markets. They could recycle their capital. So it's some of these ideas of saying, okay, who knows the most about structuring? And how do we come together to actually structure these financing, these capital stacks differently, so that we're really pushing into those capital markets, because that's where the trillion sits.
No, I think that's a really interesting and an important point. And how do our existing DFIs and financial institutions play more of an origination role, which isn't something that they've typically done in the past. So I think we are unfortunately out of time, and I'm sure we could continue this conversation otherwise, but I want to thank you all very much for joining me, and hope to continue the conversation with all of you sort of offline moving forward through our reporting, as all of these challenges continue to play out, and hopefully some of the solutions come to fruition. Thank you.
Thank you.